As we come to the Word of God this morning, would you pray with me? Father, we thank you for blessing us through your Word. We thank you for giving it to us not just as a guide for our life, but as a book that reveals you to us and allows us to have a deeper relationship with you. This morning, Father, as we examine this passage out of Luke this morning, I pray, Lord, that you would give us all ears to hear and hearts to obey. And Lord, I pray that you would get me out of the way this morning, and that instead you would speak through me, so that these words are yours and not my own. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We are continuing through a series. It's been a long series so far, through the Gospel of Luke. If you brought a Bible this morning, or you can grab one out of the pew back in front of you, we're going to begin Luke chapter 6 today. And as we do so, I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here, and I might divide us into two camps just by saying this. The camps that are very supportive of what I'm about to say, and the camps that are very, it's way too early for this, Pastor Mike. I just want you to know that there are less than 100 days until Christmas, which is an exciting thing for me. I'm seeing some of us, we got some excitement out there, we've got some eye rolling out there, and I understand both of those. But as we approach Christmas, one of the things that I start thinking about are those traditions. Did your family have traditions growing up, or do you have traditions that revolve around the holidays that you do? Because I know growing up, my family had traditions. One of our traditions around Christmas, and my sister and I, as little children, would remember this very well. Christmas Eve, we could all open one present. Which, I gotta be honest, that made the Christmas Eve church service the longest church service ever. Because we had to do that first, and then we could go home and get that present. But isn't it fun how we have these traditions? I once heard this great story about a Christmas tradition, and it was the way that the family would cook their Christmas pot roast. And so there's this mother who's got her teenage daughter helping her put the pot roast in, and they're following the recipe that's been passed down for generations. And the first step of the recipe is to cut the ends of the pot roast off. And the daughter says, "Why do we do that? What does that have to do with it?" And the mom, "I don't know. That's how my mom did it." So this teenage daughter calls up Grandma and says, "Why do we cut the ends off of the pot roast?" And Grandma, of course, says, "I don't know. That's the way my mom did it." And so she called up Great Grandma. She was ready for this answer. She asked Great Grandma, "Why do we cut the ends off of the pot roast?" And Great Grandma had to think a very long time about it. And then she remembered. And she said that the great secret to this recipe is that it wouldn't fit in my pan otherwise. Now, I tell this story for a reason. Because we have great traditions. And some of those traditions are deeply rooted in very good things. And then other traditions are those traditions that just get passed down. And they had a good reason once upon a time. But now they don't have that same good reason. Now they don't apply in the same way. When we don't stop and ask ourselves, why do we have these traditions, we are really going to miss out on what these traditions mean for us. Now, in the book of Luke, over the past several weeks, we've been looking at this group of people called the Pharisees. And as we've been talking about the Pharisees, we've learned that they have a thing for traditions. They have many traditions that they have established. And the fact of the matter is, some of these traditions, I don't even know if these guys knew why they had those traditions. They just observed these traditions because that's how their parents did it, and how their parents did it, and how the Pharisees that came before them did it. Now, one of their most serious traditions is what we're going to examine today. And it revolved around the Sabbath. That's why we read that passage out of Exodus chapter 20, which was actually the fourth commandment, where God established the Sabbath for a specific reason. But over time, something happened. And what happened was that the Pharisees got a hold of that and applied their traditions to it and really got pretty far away from what the purpose of the Sabbath was. Let's begin reading. We're in Luke chapter 6. I'd like to read just verses 1 and 2 to start. Luke chapter 6 begins, "One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Some of the Pharisees asked, 'Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?'" Let's pause there, because that's that moment of tension. There's a moment of tension in a seemingly innocent situation. I mean, this story, as we've done it so far, it doesn't look like the disciples are breaking any laws. And in fact, I took a look back, and I found a place in Deuteronomy 23, verses 24 and 25, that actually said what they were doing was perfectly okay. That passage said, you're allowed to go into your neighbor's vineyard and eat his grapes, so long as you don't put any of it in your basket and take them away. And the same thing about grain. It explicitly says this. You're allowed to pick kernels of grain with your hand, as long as you don't cut them down and take them with you. And the purpose of that was to encourage hospitality among neighbors. And so that nobody would need for food. Nobody would have a need for food. You can go into that guy's field and take what you need to eat, but not more than you need. And that was the idea that was found there. Which, for me, says that these guys aren't doing anything wrong. They're doing something that the law actually allows them to do. And it gives me the picture almost of what I would consider a lazy Sunday afternoon. I mean, they don't happen so much anymore that I'm a pastor, but I remember lazy Sunday afternoons. I remember those, and how you wouldn't do much, and you had time to go for walks. And I get that picture of these guys, these disciples who were just walking with Jesus and listening to him teach. And as they're going, they're just picking their snack as they go. It's a very lazy Sunday afternoon. But the Pharisees have a different opinion about what they are doing. They have a very hard time with this. And at first glance, it's really difficult to understand, what are they doing wrong? What is wrong with what the disciples are doing that the Pharisees would ask them this question, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now it's interesting, in some of the parallel Gospels, this story is also in Matthew and Mark. The Pharisees actually approach Jesus on this one. They don't ask the disciples, why are you doing what's unlawful? But they ask Jesus, why are your disciples doing what's unlawful? They're basically asking Jesus, aren't you going to keep your people in line? Because they're doing something wrong. But for us, we don't see what they're doing wrong. And this issue that the Pharisees raise is not so much about the activity, not so much about picking the grain, but it's the timing of the activity. Because these disciples are doing this. That's the first two words of this. They're doing this on the Sabbath. And that is where the Pharisees are taking an issue with this. Now we need to back up for a minute and have a better understanding of the Sabbath. If we were to back up all the way to Genesis, very first book in the Bible, it tells us creation of the world. And it tells the creation story in 7 days. And in the first 6 of those days, God is creating something very specific. But then on the 7th day, he rested. And something different happened at that point. Because the point was, his work was done. He did his work through those 6 days, but on that 7th day, he rested. And not only did he rest, he set it apart as something special. He set it apart as something holy. The Sabbath was meant to be different than other days because it lacked the work that was common to all the other days. And he established that for a reason. And he started establishing that with the Israelites. I found it pretty interesting as I was reading this week. When the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, and they don't have food. Remember that God sent them food from heaven. And that was that weird bread that there was no word for. They didn't know what it was, and so they called it manna, which literally in the Hebrew means, what is this? Because they didn't know what it was. And they got the manna, and every morning they would wake up and the manna was out there on the ground for them. And this happened morning after morning after morning. But something different happened. On the 6th morning that this happened, God spoke to Moses, and he says, today I want you guys to take double the amount. I want you to pick up double what you're going to need for today. Now, there was a problem with that because this manna was designed in such a way that if they took more than they needed, overnight it would start to stink and get infested with maggots, and it was just gross what would happen to this, because the design was, take just what you need for this day. Take just what you need for one day. That's where we get the idea of our daily bread. Same idea, but on the sixth day, God switched it up a bit. And he said, I need you to take more for tomorrow, because tomorrow, the seventh day, is going to be a day of Sabbath rest, where I don't even want you to do the work it takes to gather your food. I want you to have it already. And miraculously, what happened with any extras that they gathered on that day, it didn't spoil. It didn't go bad. And so we see that God even then was setting it apart, setting that seventh day apart as something special. And then he outright tells them. Exodus 20, we see it as the fourth commandment. And he tells them to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And he goes through that list of, don't you work, don't your kids work, don't your animals work, don't your servants work. Nobody works, because it needs to be set apart. On those other 6 days, you could do whatever work you want. But on that Sabbath day, you need to set that work aside as a day of rest. Now, we're good up until this point. This makes sense to us. But there's some other things that happen revolving the Sabbath. If we look back at those commands given about the Sabbath, there's one attached that I got to be very honest with. I don't like this part of the Sabbath. Because in Exodus as well, in Exodus 31 and later in Exodus 35, these are all in your note outline if you want to look it up later, make sure I'm telling you the truth here. In those two passages in Exodus, what happens is the people are commanded to observe the Sabbath, but then there's a consequence. And it says, and this is hard to accept, this is hard to understand. It says, you need to observe the Sabbath, you need to keep it holy. And if anyone is caught working on the Sabbath, you are to put them to death. And we look at that and we're like, whoa, God is serious about the Sabbath. And he was, and biblically, there is an account. There is one account in the Old Testament of a man being found working on the Sabbath. And the people were like, are you sure about this, God? Because we know what you told us to do. But the issue with that man, this story is found in Numbers 15. It gives an account of a man who was found not even really working, but he was gathering sticks. He was gathering wood. But he was doing it defiantly. He was doing it intentionally. You see, this guy knew better. He knew that he was not supposed to do this on this day. And he said, I don't really care about that prohibition. I don't really care about that rule. I'm going to go do this anyway. Because you see, in the context of that, this story is used as an illustration to differentiate between unintentional sins, those sins that we just don't know, that we don't know any better. I mean, I'm on the fence about what is an unintentional sin, having an almost 15-month-old in our house. I don't know that she sins unintentionally. It feels pretty deliberate sometimes, what she does. But this lets me see the difference. This lets me see that sometimes people do things very willfully, very rebelliously. And that's what happened to this man. And the people found him, and they took him, and they asked God, are you sure about this? What are we supposed to do with this man? And God, because he is a just God, even if it's hard for me to understand, he says the whole assembly has to take this man out of the camp and stone him. Because he rebelliously, he deliberately, he intentionally disobeyed this commandment. Now, our first reaction to the Pharisees is that what they're going off of? That the disciples simply picking grain off a stalk is the same idea? It's just as unlawful as what this man was doing or what Old Testament law required? And so when they asked, why are you doing what is unlawful? Why are they considering what the disciples are doing to be work? And you see, this really breaks down, and we're going to go back and talk about these traditions. Because the disciples really understood the Sabbath, but the Pharisees did not. They were applying the tradition of the Sabbath. We're going to differentiate between 2 points. First, we're going to look at the tradition of the Sabbath, and then we're going to look at the truth of the Sabbath. Because the tradition of the Sabbath, this is what the Pharisees thought about the Sabbath. And the Pharisees had built a very strong set of traditions about the Sabbath. And these traditions that they'd established were designed to keep people as far away from breaking the Sabbath as possible. They didn't want people to unintentionally break the Sabbath. They didn't want people to do it by accident. And so what they did, we've talked about the Pharisees like this before, is they would erect fences around that commandment. So at the center is that commandment, honor the Sabbath, or remember the Sabbath, observe the Sabbath. And they would build fences. And they would say that in order to observe the Sabbath, here's the things that you can't do. And they would build another fence around it. Here's the things that you can't do, because otherwise you're going to neglect the Sabbath. And so they built some of these traditions. They built some of these fences, these walls to protect it. But the issue was, some of these walls were ridiculous. The things that they were saying you could or could not do on the Sabbath, the things that they were saying were, in some senses, ridiculous. And in fact, I gave them to you on your note outline. I gave you, this comes from the Hebrew Mishnah. The Hebrew Mishnah was the oral commentary that the Pharisees would use to interpret the law. They would take the Torah, the law, and they would make judgments about it. It's like a commentary. We turn to commentaries today when we study, but we have to understand that that's not the same as the Bible. That's one man's thoughts, or one group of men's thoughts about the Bible. Yet they established these traditions, and they established 39 very specific prohibited activities for the Sabbath. And they said, these are the 39 things that you absolutely cannot do, or you're going to be found guilty of breaking the Sabbath. You're going to be found guilty of working on the Sabbath. And I'll be honest, some of these make a lot of sense. Some of those, as you're skimming that list, you see some like plowing and sowing and reaping and trapping and building and demolishing. That's work. That describes somebody's profession, somebody's job. And that is work to do this. But there's other items here that don't make as much sense to me. The four that I took a lot of issue with were weaving or separating two threads. I don't see that. I mean, I know that some people do that for a living, but I don't see that as work. Or the one that really was like, seriously, that's work? Maybe to a middle school or high school kid, but writing or erasing 2 or more letters. That's work? I don't think that that's work. Yet those were activities that they said you can't do. And that's why when they see the disciples doing this, when they see the disciples, as the Gospel of Luke says, that they're picking some heads of grain, rubbing them between their hands and eating the kernels, they're seeing what they're doing is things that are on their list of, no, you don't do that on the Sabbath. Now, from that list of 39 things, I don't see where it says picking heads of grain or rubbing them in their hands. I don't see where it says that, but the Pharisees, because they were, in a big sense, legalists, they interpreted those two actions, picking heads of grain, rubbing them between their hands, as reaping, taking or getting the plant off of the stalk in this case, and threshing, separating the edible stuff from the non-edible stuff. And so they're saying, disciples, you are reaping and you are threshing, and that's why you are breaking our law. Now, do you see how far away from the heart of the law they have got? They have walked so far from that heart, from the truth of the Sabbath, which we'll get into. They're not resting anymore. I think in some senses, it would be more work to follow these rules, to follow these traditions, than it would just to rest, which was the intent of the Sabbath. I did a small amount of research in our culture today, in modern times. For a devout Jew, how could they follow these 39 prohibited activities? How could they keep away from this? And the one that just blew me away, the easiest way to break any of these prohibitions is by using electricity. Because in today's culture, they equate that with lighting a fire. They equate electricity with the same function as lighting a fire. So on the Sabbath, no joke, a devout Jew would stay away from using electricity. And I mean, I'm a millennial. I can't do that. I can't stay away from using electricity. I can't not use my car. I can't not turn the lights on. We can't function in today's society without using electricity. And so what they've done, actually, is they found some workarounds to that. And they said, okay, if we can't use electricity on the Sabbath, let's just use all of our electricity the day before the Sabbath. Or set it up in such a way that we're not actually using it. And so some of these workarounds were, if you knew you needed a light on in that room, you would turn the light on the day before and just leave it on. Because turning the light switch on and off was work. I mean, and I know some of this, I'm telling you this for a reason. This is a mix of humor but also of seriousness. These are serious things because this is spiritual bondage that these people are in. They would go so much as to say, it's okay, we can install a timer on our lights and let it turn on or off automatically as long as we're not the ones doing it. It's very common to go back to that light switch thing, very common on the day before, especially for people who just do things out of habit, because if you're like me, you walk into a room and you turn the light on. They would put tape so you couldn't turn the light on. Or they actually sell decorative light switch covers that you install before and take off after, so you don't accidentally do that. And the craziest part of all this to me was that you have to, the day before the Sabbath, you have to go inside your fridge, take the light bulb out, and then shut the door. Because if you open that door and that light turns on, you have worked. Now, today, we're pretty clever in our workarounds, right? I mean, those are pretty clever ways to get around those prohibitions. The Pharisees were just as bad. I mean, they didn't have electricity to worry about, but what the Pharisees would do, one of those things, the last one on that list, talked about how far you could take something. 4 cubits. You couldn't take something further than 4 cubits from the private sector to the public sector. Basically from your house to not your house. And so what they would do to get around this is the day before the Sabbath, they would take their chair and they would take it almost 4 cubits away from their house and they would put it down there and say, now my house is this big. It exists where my house is, but it also exists right here in my chair. So I can walk further on the Sabbath. They were legalists about this. And yet they are coming at Jesus and his disciples. And they are saying, why are you breaking the law? Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Do you see the disconnect? Do you see how far away they are from actually observing the law? Because they are so used to finding ways to get around it, and they are so intent on bringing Jesus and his disciples down, that they ignore their own issues and point out the issues in Jesus and in his disciples. Now, this is why in Mark 7:8, Jesus accuses the Pharisees. He condemns the Pharisees. And he tells them, you have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. Basically what they have done is they have exchanged the law of God, which was designed to protect the Sabbath, and we'll talk about why. They've let go of that to hold on to all these traditions that are pretty impossible to follow. At least they are highly difficult to follow all of these traditions. And so in the time of Jesus Christ, these traditions of the Sabbath, they had really obscured, they had really covered up the truth of the Sabbath. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what the truth of the Sabbath is, because that's what we need to understand. When we peel away these traditions and we get down to the truth of the Sabbath, what we're going to find is not just another rule to follow, but we're going to find a blessing in the Sabbath. We're going to see that the Sabbath was created for us. The truth of the Sabbath can be found by looking back at the Old Testament. How did God intend for people to keep the Sabbath? And he intended them to do it for 2 reasons. The first thing that we find when we look at the Old Testament is that the Sabbath, that day set apart, the Sabbath was created for worship. The Sabbath was created for worship. It was set aside. It was made holy. He established it as a sign so that people would know he's God. So that people would have a day set apart to reflect on that fact. In fact, on the Sabbath day, there were special burnt offerings that were given in the Jewish temple. There was a ceremonial food offering called the bread of the presence, or also called show bread, that they would put out on the altar to remind them of God's presence among them, of God's sustenance for them. And that was an activity that happened on the Sabbath. In fact, Ezekiel records that Sabbath sacrifices were actually brought in by a whole different route to the temple. It wasn't normal. There was nothing normal about the Sabbath because it was set aside as a day of worship. And I'll be honest, if you're here today, you are observing this about the Sabbath. You have set aside time on this day of the week to worship. Once a week on our Sabbath, on Sunday. Notice I'm not going to go into that debate. Should it be Saturday? Should it be Sunday? We're here Sunday, so I'm going to call it the Sabbath, because that's when we are worshiping. We are here to worship. We gather as a body. We are united by Jesus Christ in order to worship God. And we do through our songs. We do through our worship, through our giving of gifts, through the listening of the Word of God. This intentional form of worship is reserved for the Sabbath. Because you probably don't do this any other day of the week. It's Sundays that we do this. And we set it apart to do that. So that's the first truth of the Sabbath. It was created for worship. Now the second truth is the one that we've really got to be careful to define. And that's the most obvious, that the Sabbath was created for rest. The Sabbath was created for rest. We see this again in Exodus 20. Where God says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Now it's interesting here. As we define work, we're going to help get to a definition of rest. The Hebrew word for work here, melakah, what that word refers to is it generally refers to employment, or your ministry, or what you do for a living, your business. It's not so much referring to any manual labor, period, whether that's digging a ditch in your backyard, or spending time in an office, or managing your home, or flipping a light switch. That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about is your employment. 6 days of the week are good for that. Work on those 6 days of the week. Be productive on those. But then we come to this seventh day that's been set aside for that simple purpose of rest. And we get this all the way back in the beginning. When God was done creating, He rested. And let me let you in on a secret. That's not because He needed to. He wasn't exhausted after the creation of the universe because He's all powerful. He hadn't spent all of His energy in creating the world. Instead, what He does is He rests to set an example for us. Not because He's gaining anything out of it, but He knows us. He knows our limitations. The intent of the Sabbath, as we follow God's example, is to rest and to be refreshed. This is also in Exodus. Exodus 31:17 talks that on the seventh day God rested and was refreshed. And He puts this here for us because unlike God, we're not all powerful. We are going to run out of steam. We are going to run out of energy. And I know this in my life, on those days where I don't, or on those weeks or those months where I don't have time to rest, I'm going to run out of energy. I'm not going to be able to keep working as hard as I want to. And so this is a very physical and practical concern. We're talking about the Sabbath and resting on the Sabbath, and it has huge implications for us, and they're practical. Because if we don't observe the Sabbath, if we don't rest on this day, we're going to pay the natural price for this. There's a natural consequence that comes. And we're going to burn ourselves out. And I know this because I am very, very bad at rest. I'm very bad at rest. If we ignore God's command to rest, to observe the Sabbath, we pay that price. Because God knew He made us with these specific limitations. Our energy is going to run out. But He gave us the Sabbath in order to recharge, to refresh us. Now further, and I love this part, this rest that we get from the Sabbath is a sneak peek of something coming. And a sneak peek is, you get just a taste of it, a foretaste. And it's a sneak peek. The author of Hebrews writes this in Hebrews 4. It's a foretaste of the rest that God promises us when we are with Him in heaven. The rest that we take on the Sabbath gets our minds set on that. Because we know that when sin came into the world, stuff stopped working like it was supposed to. When you think back to the garden and the work that Adam and Eve had to do, you know what their work was? It was to take care of the garden. And there weren't weeds at that point yet. So they're taking care of the garden. That's nothing like our taking care of the garden. When we take care of the garden, we know that that is work with a capital W. But for them, their work was enjoyment. Their work was restful, and they gained something out of it. Not only that, but they had that relationship with God. He would come and walk with them. He would come and spend time with them. And that's the kind of rest that the Sabbath gives us this peek of, gives us this glimpse of, because we have this hope of this rest in heaven. We have this hope because we know that the world's fallen apart around us. And yet we can have hope. And when we rest on the Sabbath, that gets our minds in the right frame. That gets our minds focused on the right thing. But if we don't, if we're failing to observe the Sabbath, if we're failing to rest, then we lose sight of that promise. We don't see what God has for us. Now that's at the heart of the Sabbath. Hopefully we see from this that the Pharisees probably started out really good and really understanding that the Sabbath was created for worship and for rest. But when they piled their traditions on top of that, they couldn't ever get to worship or rest. They couldn't cut through those traditions to get to the heart of what the Sabbath was about. And that's why they're so upset with the disciples. That's why they're so upset with Jesus. And they ask that question of, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? And then Jesus gives them this incredibly confusing reply because it has nothing to do with the Sabbath. Let's continue. Luke 6, starting in verse 3. They just asked the question, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Jesus answered them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now Jesus' answer here has two parts. The first, very loosely at best, connected to the Sabbath. Because I always, when I read this just at a glance, I thought, oh, well, David must have done this on the Sabbath, and that's the issue. He went in the temple when he wasn't supposed to, and that's why Jesus is talking about this. This is not happening on the Sabbath. When we go back to this story found in 1 Samuel 21, Jesus provides a very good summary of the events, but what happens is David and his men are sent on a mission by the king, and they run out of food, and so they go to the temple, and they say, we have nothing to eat. Can we have 5 loaves of bread? Not a very big request. But what the priests say is, we don't have anything that's fair game for you to eat. All we have is the consecrated bread. Consecrated means set aside, holy. We have the holy bread. A few minutes ago we talked about that bread of the presence, or the show bread. That's what this is. This is that bread that represented God's presence and sustenance that was set out on the altar on the Sabbath for a week. And then the priests would replace it and eat what was on the altar previously. So it was fair game for the priests to eat, but not for David, and not for David's men. That's not how this worked. Yet David came, he asked for it, he received it, and he ate it. What David did here is he violated those traditions. And Jesus is pointing back to that, and he's saying, don't you remember when David set aside those traditions? Don't you remember when David, he needed that bread. His men needed food. And so they set aside those traditions. I shared earlier that this story also shows up in 2 other Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark. And in studying these, which is always a good idea, if you see something in the Gospel and it's confusing to you, chances are one of the other 3 Gospel writers also wrote about it. And they might have included different details to help. And I was so thankful that both Matthew and Mark did. They included different details in this. They remembered more of what Jesus had said. In fact, in Matthew 12, Jesus follows up his reference to David and this showbread. He says, or haven't you read in the law that the priests of the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? Now let's unpack that a minute, because this is something that I struggle with. Most pastors get a day of rest. Most pastors take Monday off. But why aren't they condemned for Sunday? They're working Sunday. They're working on the Sabbath. Why aren't they condemned for that? And that's what Jesus is pointing out here. He says there's priests that work on the Sabbath, and yet they're not condemned. There's people that would disobey your traditions, and you're not going after them. And he says something very telling here. After he gives them that example of these priests that work on the Sabbath, he tells them this. Jesus says, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And what Jesus is claiming here is so incredible. Because he's telling the Pharisees that if you think the temple is so important, the place of worship for God is so important, and you're trying to protect that, you're trying to remember the Sabbath. However, there's something even greater. There's something more important. There's something of higher priority than the temple. And what Jesus is saying here, he's pointing to himself. And he is saying, yeah, the temple, that's an amazing place. It's an amazing way that was created for us to worship God. And if you're trying to protect your relationship with that, you got to pay attention, because something's about to change. Jesus is saying, now that I'm here, things are going to be different. Things are going to change. And the comparison that he makes is that his disciples should be held blameless. Because just like the priests are doing their duty in the temple, the disciples are doing their duty to Jesus Christ. They are spending time with Jesus Christ. And what Jesus is saying is, don't condemn them for that. You don't know what's happening here. You don't know that they are observing the Sabbath by spending time with me. He also says this in Matthew 12. And we looked at this last week in another parallel gospel. He tells the Pharisees, if you'd known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Last week we talked about this. It's a passage out of Hosea 6, where it talks about the false worship of Israel and how they really weren't doing it right. They were giving their sacrifices, but they were ignoring everything else. They were not loving other people. They did not have unity with other people. They saw the poor and ignored the poor. And they didn't have mercy on them. And what Jesus says here to these Pharisees is, if you would just get that, then you would have a better understanding of the Sabbath. Because again, you're not understanding the heart of the law. You're stacking your own stuff on it. You're doing your own thing with the law. And that's ultimately false worship. That's ultimately a false observance of the law. And that's what Jesus accuses them of. Turning to Mark. Mark 2, 23 through 28 has this story, the same exact story. But again, there's one extra thing added to that. And when we see this extra thing, light bulbs are going to go on. It's going to make sense for us. When Jesus shares this story about how David went against the traditions, it's going to make sense of why he is doing this. And those are these simple words. After the account of what David did, Jesus explains, he says this, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Do you see how he's reversing the order of what the Pharisees are thinking? The Pharisees are thinking, it's our job to observe the Sabbath. The only way we can be righteous is if we cross all these things off our list and observe the Sabbath. And what Jesus is saying is, you're not getting the point. That's not what the Sabbath was for. The Sabbath was not this big long list of things that you have to do, these hoops you have to jump through. Instead, the Sabbath was created to give you an opportunity to worship and to rest. And he turns it around for them, and he wants them to understand it because he knows his disciples get it. They realize that the Sabbath was created for their benefit. It's a day of blessing for them. But what happened with the Pharisees is what started out as that day of rest and that day of worship had become so perverted by their traditions. They'd stacked so many things on top of it that there was no benefit of the Sabbath. I mean, I could not imagine living in this way. I would be fearful as the Sabbath approached. There's 39 ways for me to mess up. I'm probably going to mess up. I'm probably not going to observe this in the right way. When instead, we should approach the Sabbath with hope and with joy. That's the day I get to go worship. Or for some of us, that's the day I get to go rest. That's the day I can take it. I don't have to work. I don't have to do those things that are normal in any other day of the week. It's different. It's holy. It's set apart. And then what he says, and he says this in all three of the Gospels. Verse 5 of Luke 6. Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And what he means by this ties it all together. What he is claiming here, what he's letting the Pharisees know, is that the Sabbath that was intended to worship God, the Sabbath that was intended for us to find rest, Jesus is saying, I'm here to fulfill both of those things. I am here, and you don't have to do it your old way, the way that wasn't working anymore. I am here, and I'm going to give you rest. And just by spending time with me, Jesus says, you're worshiping. You're ascribing the worth to me because you're spending time with me. And that's what he means when he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's also a claim, and it's a great claim, and the Pharisees sure don't miss it. It's a claim that Jesus is God. It is a claim of deity. It's incredibly theologically charged. And it's shortly after this that the Pharisees start to realize we've got a problem. This Jesus guy is claiming to be God. How is that going to work? How is that supposed to work? What are we going to do about it? But Jesus even goes one step further than that. If you could even go one step further than that. And what Jesus is making very clear to the Pharisees is that, yes, the Sabbath is important. Remember the Sabbath. Observe the Sabbath. But Jesus is more important than the Sabbath. Jesus is more important than jumping through those hoops. Loving Jesus is more important than anything else that we can do. And that's what he's trying to communicate. He's trying to let them know it's not about your hoops. It's not about your check boxes. It's not about the things you think you can do. It's about loving me. It's about loving Jesus. And the Pharisees, because they bent backwards to try and fulfill these self-imposed traditions so that they could achieve their self-imposed righteousness, they didn't like this. Because what Jesus had done is he just ripped their entire spiritual economy out from under them. They had these check boxes. They had these hoops for a reason, and it's because it made them feel good. It made them feel holy. It made them feel righteous. And what Jesus is saying is it's not about those things. Those things are good. Observing the Sabbath is good. But if that's what you're doing, just to check these things off your box, you're missing the point. Further, what this means, what Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath means, is if the disciples were doing something wrong, don't you think the Lord of the Sabbath would have corrected them about it? Don't you think Jesus would have said, you probably shouldn't do that with the grain because you're working? But he doesn't, because he knows that they're not breaking the law. He knows that they are not doing anything except for breaking the traditions set there by the Pharisees. And in Jesus' economy, those traditions mean nothing. Those traditions are not what establishes a relationship with him. In Jesus' economy, it's all based on love. It's all based on loving him. And in fact, later on in the Gospel of Luke, somebody comes to him and he says, what's the greatest commandment? He's actually trying to trip Jesus up. Because if Jesus can elevate one commandment above another, they can go, nope, you're wrong on that, and here's why. So he's trying to catch Jesus in a mistake. But he asks him, what's the greatest commandment? And you'd expect one of the big 10. Love the Lord, or honor the Sabbath, honor your parents, don't murder, don't kill, any of that stuff. But what happens instead is Jesus says, okay, you want the greatest? The greatest is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. That's the most important thing that you can do. And in saying that, he's proving he's Lord of the Sabbath. He's proving that he doesn't need these traditions. The disciples got it. The Pharisees didn't. For us today, we're at that crossroads too. We could either get this, understand what Jesus is saying, or we could say, no, I like my traditions. I like the fact that when I go to church, I feel better about myself. I like the fact that when I jump through these hoops, when I serve in these ways, I feel more righteous. I feel more connected to God. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing those things. We've talked about this before. If we're doing those things under the approach that we are either earning or buying our relationship with God, we're going to fall flat on our face later on. Because we can't do either of those things. We can't earn it. We can't buy it. It is by grace that we have this relationship with God. Now, how are we going to apply this today? Beyond that. We don't deal with the same issues that the Pharisees are bringing up. We don't have a lot of people who are saying, well, you drove your car here today. You worked. Shame on you. We don't have that. So what are we supposed to do with this information? The first piece that I think we ought to do, and this might be a stretch for some of us, we might have to understand, how am I supposed to do this? That first thing is to observe the Sabbath. Now wait a minute, Pastor Mike. You just said it's not about those hoops. It's not about those check boxes. It's not about those things that I can do to earn anything. No, that's not the reason why we observe the Sabbath. We're not trying to earn anything. We're not trying to get our spiritual merit badges. That's not why we observe the Sabbath. Instead, we observe the Sabbath because it blesses us. When we observe the Sabbath, it is a blessing to us. I've heard it from people sitting in this room today that Sunday is the best day of the week. And I have to wonder, well, why? What are we doing different than any other day of the week? And it boils down to those two, maybe three things. It boils down to the fact that we are worshiping. We have gathered together to worship. The fact that we are resting. And then the fact, and I see it every Sunday morning in this church, the fact that we are fellowshipping. The fact that we are with other believers. Those things are a blessing from the Sabbath. And for those of us who have ever had to miss a Sunday, aren't you just ready to get your tank filled the next week? Aren't you just ready to come back and to get that tank filled back up? Because we know that when we observe the Sabbath, not as those hoops or those rules, we are blessed by it. Now, the second thing that we need to do in doing this, in observing the Sabbath, is we need to avoid the extremes of this. We need to avoid the extremes. And here's what I mean by that. We can take this to an extreme like the Pharisees did. And they said, okay, if you want to observe the Sabbath, here's the list of 39 things you can't do on the Sabbath. And that's a very extreme approach. And the more and more we start doing that, the more legalistic we become. The more we think, well, I can't do that because it's work. Or I can't go to that restaurant because I'm making somebody else work on that day. Or I can't barbecue outside because that's work for me. Or I can't do my house projects because that's work. The more legalistic we become, the less we're going to enjoy the Sabbath. Because again, it's going to be those hoops to jump through. It's going to be those boxes to check off. But then we have that other extreme as well. And that other extreme is a very lazy approach to the Sabbath. Because in observing the rest part of it, we also need to observe the worship part of it. And I'm going to go from preaching to meddling a little bit here. Because I know I've been there. Where some Sunday mornings, 2 hours of extra sleep, that sounds a whole lot better than getting up and going to church. And maybe I want that. But that's an extreme view of the Sabbath. I have to tell a funny story. Yesterday was a very long day for my family. We had our in-laws in town. We had lunch with them. I had to work all morning yesterday, and I drove out to Prescott Valley to have lunch with them. Couldn't get in the first place we wanted. Had to go to a second place. It was IHOP, so it was still good. But after that, we got them to the shuttle, and then I realized, I've got all these errands to run. And my wife says, okay, we'll split the errands up. I'll go do these things, you go do these things. And when we get home, let's just rest. Tonight, let's watch a movie. Let's make this about us. Let's get an us night. And at the time, in the middle of stuff, I was like, yes, I want an us night. I want a night of no distractions. I've shared we have an almost 15-month-old in the house. She had other plans last night. And it wasn't an us night. And so this morning, when we're running on fumes, and we're like, wow, okay, I gotta go to church. I gotta do another thing. I gotta cross something else off my box. And if it wasn't, I'm gonna be very candid here. If it wasn't for somebody asking me this morning, Pastor Mike, are you happy? I would have lost my perspective on this, on the joy that is in celebrating the Sabbath. And let me tell you, this Sabbath is big. This Sunday is big. We had our kids help out earlier. I get to dunk 5 people after church. And I'm going to bring them back up too. These are things, these are causes for joy. And if I don't approach the Sabbath in that way, if I think, well, I just got to go worship now. Time to go worship God. Time to do that. I'm going to miss the point. And so we've got to be careful in our observation of the Sabbath when we remember the Sabbath to avoid those extremes. Because the point of this whole thing is in verse 5. When Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, what he is saying, get your priorities straight. That's what he's saying, is that he is the focal point of the Sabbath. Our priorities, they're how we judge what's important and not important. And as a Christian, shouldn't our highest priority, even in our observance of the Sabbath, especially in coming to church, shouldn't our highest priority be Jesus Christ? That should be the highest priority. That should be the number one thing on our list. This Sunday, we have an opportunity to do that. We have a song to sing. We're going to celebrate baptism. So let me challenge you. If that's not where your priority is right now, this day's not over. This day is not over. If your priority was not for worship or for rest, we can change it right now. And we can move forward and be blessed by the Sabbath. And not just be blessed by the Sabbath, but be blessed by the Lord of the Sabbath. Would you pray with me? Father God, thank you so much for establishing this day, this Sabbath day for us. You've given it to us for our benefit, for our blessing. Lord, I pray that would be our priority, focusing on you and not on the hoops, not on the rules, not on the do's and don'ts, but instead, Father, on worshiping you and on spending time here gazing upon the face of your Son. Father, I ask today that you would draw us closer to you, that you would call our hearts to you, and that you would bless us through our Sabbath celebration. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.